Hello, everyone, and welcome to an impromptu episode of the Land of Confusion. I was hoping to get in maybe another week and set up with a guest, but as often happens, conversations happen on Ricochet, and we suddenly people will say, "Why don't we do the show?" And I said, "Sure." And then the guy who engendered all the questions and led to the conversation, of course, had an appointment, and that is my co-host Flicker. So, what could be more important than at a last minute, literally let them day with 24 hours notice show, especially when you're 12 hours ahead of me, and when I send it to you, it's at 7 a.m. So here we have today Brian G. Stevens, who's been on the show a few times, and we were going to talk about what led up to this situation. And of course, it was a post by one of someone who I still have to maybe tomorrow I'll have the energy to sit down and actually finally put together episode 75 with Dr. Bastiat, because there was situations kept happening because people kept saying each other's real names.
It's the episode that's lost to time.
Well, I still have it. There's definitely an episode that was lost to time, and that was the 2020 election night results. And I said after trying to put that together, it was like, you know what, I'm too drunk to allow this to be published. Okay,
I understand that.
And we went to bed that night thinking he was going to win.
Yeah. I went to bed that night with a cat with a cone in its head sleeping on me because he was so miserable. So, and I'm downstairs on the floor. So that was a long night all around.
Mm-hmm. So Doc Bastiat posted one of the great posts of Ricochet titles. What is it here? Leftists learning from their mistakes while riding unicorns through lakes of cotton candy.
That should have gotten posted of the week just on the title.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one part of the conversation came, and I said I thought I might make a post on it, and then it started to get really complicated, and Flicker said, well, maybe you could just talk about it and Land of Confusion, and that might work. So I like talking more than I like writing. So one of the things that it is dawned that I feel like is happening in the zeitgeist is you can actually kind of look at from a psychological perspective. And so this kind of hit me when I was in a workshop on Alfred Adler. Adler is he was one of the early psychiatrists. I mean, he was a medical doctor. The original psychology came from actual doctors, because I had these patients that were coming in with all of these complaints that weren't physical. So Adler was one of the early people, like Jung, who worked with Freud. Like Jung, he eventually had a falling out with Freud, because Freud had fallings out with everybody. That's how Freud was. Just as a side note, I do think Freud gets a bad rap these days. A lot of what his innovations we just take for granted, and now we make fun of him for the stuff he got wrong. It'd be kind of like, taking everything Newton said for granted and just making fun of him because he believed in alchemy.
Or the apple stuff that fell off his head and stuff.
Yeah. So Adler kind of went. In some ways, I think of him as kind of an early cognitive behaviorist before we had the term cognitive behavioral psychology. He really looked at the way people tell themselves stories, what strategies they come up and what narratives. While Freud kind of felt we were pushed by our past, Adler really felt we were drawn to the future, that we would kind of pick something out in the future and be trying to get to that. As a therapist, I kind of think it's somewhere in between. And I will say, since this is a conservative website, Adler was married to a pretty hardcore socialist and a socialist idealist, and of course I have some grace for people back then because they don't have the knowledge that we have today. There's really no excuse to be a socialist today, other than I like to ignore the past.
Up to me, it's a lot of indoctrination and brainwashing.
Yeah. So, but Adler had a couple of things. He talked about. He says, well, if you think about where we start in life, is as infants, we're just these helpless creatures. And adults are these all-powerful giants. And even if I got a 2-year-old older sibling, they're still more powerful than me, right? So we come into this world with kind of this sense of inferiority. And his idea was, well, how do we come up with strategies to make ourselves feel superior or less inferior, really? But, how do we cope with that? And then there's different ways of coping with things. Adler was the one that originally came up with birth order effects, and how firstborns can tend to have clusters of traits, and secondborns and thirdborns and whatnot can tend to have clusters of traits. It's not guaranteed, and sometimes there'll be a gap. My wife is the firstborn of set 2 after an 8-year gap. And so she very much functions, more like a firstborn child. So what do we do to feel superior? And Adler kind of talked about 2 different ways that we could do this. Kind of a vertical way to feel better. So if I can put myself above you, I can feel better about myself. Or cooperative. So it's kind of competitive or cooperative, right? How do we work together? You can see this, you can kind of see this, it's to me, it's kind of funny, it's the sort of things, what game am I playing to win? You can kind of see it dysfunctionally in marriages. So I'm playing a game to, I want to beat my wife at, the game of cleaning the house, right? And somehow we've turned it into a competition. I'm just going to not care about the clutter. I'm superior at that, or instead of kind of working together. How do we complement each other? So it struck me. We're kind of going over this in a training, and it really struck me that part of what I think we're seeing is a whole bunch of people trying to feel superior competitively instead of cooperatively. And so, I can, Chris, like on Ricochet, I can tell you right now, the number one way people try to play the competitive game is what I call the smartest guy in the room game.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of it too, because it's an old game I try to play. I can play it pretty well. Of course, the problem is if you're the ultimate winner of smartest man in the room, you are the smartest man in the room, because there's nobody else in the room with you because you're intolerable.
Right.
So the problem with these competitive strategies to feel less inferior, to feel superior, is they don't actually get you what you want. I mean, you might feel superior in the short term, but in the long term, it increases your alienation. You don't actually find peace and happiness. Where, as opposed to using the smartest guy in the room as an example, I might know a lot about, therapy. Okay, well, this is where I'm an expert, and I can talk about this stuff. I might get with Phil and say, about engineering, right? Or you've done stuff with the elections and been on the inside of that. So that can become the cooperative way, right? I can be good where I'm at, and it's okay for somebody else to be good where they are. So I started thinking about kind of the modern world and the Twitter world, which is very toxic and this stuff, but what's going on? What's going on with all this intersectionality? And what I'm thinking we're seeing a lot of is this whole, I've got to be the ever greater victim, right? That's how I move up this hierarchy.
Right.
So I'm better than you. I have more virtue than you because I have virtue by being a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm a victim, I don't have to have agency. Bad things happen to me, and it's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault.
Mm-hmm.
And the greater victim I am, the less agency I have. And I've seen this in clients, not just the whole social justice side of things, but clients who've been legitimately victims of things,
mm-hmm.
who have this learned helplessness, and they really adopt the role of victim, right? That's my identity.
Mm-hmm. The
problem is, if you're a victim, like I said, you don't have any agency. So good news, I'm not responsible for all the bad things happen to me. Bad news, I have no control over the bad things that happen to me.
Right.
And so what you get is really, so if you pursue the victim strategy to not feel inferior, you end up feeling miserable.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we talk about with clients with trauma is we don't talk about being a victim. We talk about being a survivor.
Right.
Because I don't want those people to have the victim mentality. It really kind of struck me. It's like, holy cow, what's going on here is these people are really trying to find some sense of answer to, right, I feel inferior. How can I feel superior? Mm-hmm. And the victim, of course there's indoctrination. People are selling it, but they buy into this so that I can have my own identity, and it's going to let me have some sense of virtue and power.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the harder I pursue this strategy, the worse I'm going to feel, because it sucks to be a victim.
Right. Speaking as a survivor, I guess is the term they use. But yeah, I did my 9 months of therapy. It's been an interesting experience.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so we always, in therapy, you're always talking about how do you give people power? How do you give people agency? It's one of the things we've done with our kids has always been give them as much power and control as they can handle.
Mm.
As soon as they can handle it, because that gives them more sense of agency, and then they learn that they have power and I'm not helpless. Because the reality is they're going to come up with some strategy to try to get their needs met anyway. And so I think what we have culturally is a whole bunch of people who don't know they haven't been taught, they haven't learned another way to try to survive or to try to feel better. And they latch on to this whole victim culture, and it makes them short term kind of feel better about themselves, but in the long term, they end up feeling miserable.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, okay, that I can see what's going on. And I think Twitter is your poster child for that. Mm-hmm. Right. And I've got to be, and it becomes, if I've got to go find something to be angry about. I have to go find some place where there's oppression. And it almost, it's almost like a drug.
Yep.
I got to get my next hit. I got to get that next hit of outrage. Mm-hmm. Now you can see this. That's not just the left, right? You can see this on the right. This sense, oh, I'm a victim, and this has happened, and I'm going to have outrage. And, you guys are persecuting me, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot more prevalent on the left, on the kind of the far left side of the spectrum.
Well, the right always comes along, and the left always goes and does something, and the right comes along and perfects it. So,
yeah.
Fortunately, the right's is watching the left doing things, and they're like, okay, well, if that's the way you think this needs to go, we'll do it, and we'll perfect it, and you won't like that result.
Right, and that's going to be awful. Mm. So, yeah, and it's kind of funny because what the realization did for me was I stopped being as I don't know, kind of reactively angry to a lot of the stuff that those folks are doing on the left. I mean, I don't want to see people canceled and the whole 9 yards. I mean, when they're doing actually damage. But I think it awakened in me a great deal of pity and sadness. Because, man, look at all these people out there, just miserable. And what an awful way to live. And so, I don't know, that kind of, now it's kind of funny because here I have, I've got more pity than I might be for other, I'm sure people at Ricochet say, well, Bryan doesn't seem to have a lot of pity a lot of times when he's posting.
Yeah. Well, posting always seems to drain out things. Yeah. My boss will send me emails, and I know if she were talking to me, she would be like the very sweet sing-song voice, but when she writes it, it's like, and
I think some of it is you're harder on the people closer to you.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's, if I get it, it's like, look, you should know better.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're on our side. You ought to know better than to have this dribble or something. So sometimes I think it's I've got to go back and remind myself, well, there's I don't have it all figured out. I'm not the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah. Long ago realized I was not the smartest person in the room. Having two parents who are both PhDs and their friends around.
Right.
You get to see, but then you get to see what smart people are like in person, and you kind of lower your regard. They're the two people I have the least respect for are politicians and people with doctorates.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's you kind of see it from the inside. And so, like for you growing up, then it's like, you know what? The smartest guy in the room is not a strategy I'm going to pursue.
Yeah.
Right. And I think my interactions with you would say that that's not a strategy that you've worked to pursue. But you have two people in our role-playing group who clearly have both pursued that in the past.
Yeah.
Sometimes pursue it now.
Yeah.
So it's actually pretty common for intelligent people to be in love with their own intelligence, and it's the technocratic siren is one that I can hear. Right? If we could just, I'm smart enough to figure this out. If we could just organize everything the way I said, things would be great.
Right. I still always like William F. Buckley's. My favorite quote from him is that I'd rather trust the first 200 people in the phone book to govern us than the staff of Harvard. I'm like, yes, you have it.
I agree. I'm with that 100% because when people are in love with their own brilliance, they do really foolish things.
Right.
I'm so smart I can figure this out. And so of course I joke, one of my buddies who's also pretty bright, we do kind of joke, well, no, I don't, since I'm all for a dictatorship if it can be me, but since it can't be me, I don't want a dictatorship, But I know if I had the power, I'd screw things up. That's what history tells us. Yeah. We would always screw things up.
Yeah, I think my favorite version of that is Anthony Perkins, the sci-fi writer, who wrote the history bio of a space tyrant. And the guy is running for basically the president of the United States, but set in Jupiter. And he loses the election. They hold basically a constitutional conference and appoint him a Greek dictator equivalent. And
I think that's Piers Anthony.
Piers Anthony, yes, thank you. Anthony Perkins, the actor. So yeah, and just just the descriptions of things, and he's about 10 years into it. He's like, I really screwed things up with this absolute power, and everyone was trying to kill me. Maybe I should leave.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've read the series. Yeah, and it's an interesting evolution because he's a decent guy who screws things up. Because I've got that bit where he basically goes undercover as an ordinary guy, getting to see how his policies are being implemented, and he's like, "Wait a minute, this sucks!"
Right?
What the hell?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was young when I read that. It took me a while to figure out that.
I read it in like my first year of college or something like that.
Oh yeah, I was in maybe high school, or it's like, oh wait, this is an allegory. I like book 2. Oh, Titans Japan. Oh, but yeah. And I think that's true. Unfortunately, a lot of politicians fall in love with their own power, and they think, well, if you just do it my way, it would be good.
Yep.
And I think I responded to Arizona Patriot today in something. He was responding to somebody else about not thinking. Is it possible? I think he said, is it possible the politicians know more than you do about something? He said it to somebody else. And I was like, no good. I've known too many politicians.
Yeah. Well, one of the smartest politicians I've ever met is the premier of premier of Alberta. And in the last few years, I've seen him do some really stupid things. And the smartest politician I have not met, I think, is Gingrich. And he still has got kind of wacky out their ideas, but
yeah, I have met him. So because he was from my district, and he's a decent guy, and he's really bright, and he has had a lot of. He did engineer the contract with America to get the Republican Revolution, and basically once the Republicans are in power, that after a little while they effectively ousted him because he was threatening to them.
Yeah.
And so I think he was smart and he engineered that, but too wonkish to be a good politician.
Right.
And keep from having his, kind of being ousted.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what makes you a good politician doesn't necessarily make you a good leader. You have rare individuals like Reagan who both seem to have they have the intellectual heft, they have the people skills, and the ability to execute. But like with Reagan, in Peter's book, what I learned from Ronald Reagan, one of the things that's very clear that Reagan had going for him was Nancy.
Yeah.
Right. So Nancy could be the heavy and the bad guy and let Reagan be kind of affable, good guy. But they were a pretty scary duo.
Yeah.
And functioned well as a couple. And I think actually, they used the joke behind every great man, there's a powerful woman or something along those lines.
Yep.
I think there's something to be said for that.
Yep. I would just watch I, Claudius for how that works out for most of Augustus Caesar's life up until the last little bit.
So, yeah, I mean, that's, but I've known too many politicians, and some, it's like, they're okay. Some of them are okay.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of normal, ordinary people.
Yep.
But they're, even the president of the United States, has to stand naked in front of the mirror once in a while.
Yep. I understand that with the current president, that's usually 3 or 4 hours a day.
So somebody comes to get him to.
Or if he has an all-female Secret Service detachment.
Really?
Oh, you haven't heard about that? Okay.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, there's definitely a video out there of him groping someone, and the Marine boyfriend trying to beat him up. He has a certain reputation. All the females on his Secret Service detail as vice president didn't want to be there.
So I would believe that.
Yeah,
based upon his behavior.
Yeah.
But it's okay because he's a Democrat. And,
right.
So, well, yeah. Of course, it's kind of funny. I because he's old, and it's like in 2024, as a Trump supporter, I don't want Trump to run just because he's going to be old.
Yeah. Some people seem to be able to pull that one off when they're old. It can be sharp. Both Trump and Bernie seem to have that going for them. But Biden reminds me of my father in his 80s. My father was one of the smartest people I ever met. But in my father's 80s, he was like not.
Right.
Yeah. My father is like 78 and he's like, I can't drive anymore. And he was right.
Right. And it depends. But I can tell you from a scientific reality, anybody who's in their 70s going into their 80s, anybody, even if they look sharp, if you were to go do the Lurie, Nebraska cognitive test, will come back with some deficits.
Yeah.
That's just the sad reality of what happens with our brains. And I mean, right now, you and I would not be able to do as well on cramming for tests and studying for them like we could back when we were 20.
Wait, I had to cram for stuff in the 20s? But certainly can't stay 36 hours up straight doing work like that, like I did in my 20s, stuff like that. Yeah. Like getting by like 2 hours sleep a night. Why the hell
they put New Year's Eve? Why does the changeover have to be at midnight? Could we roll that back? But ultimately, you get old, you have some brain. So in 2024, I very much hope Trump plays kingmaker.
Yeah.
I don't need to be president. I will say this: he did 4 years of a very stressful presidency, and did not seem to age a whole lot.
Yeah.
Which was unusual.
Yep.
Jimmy Carter went gray.
Right. So Obama went gray. I mean,
yeah. Bush looked a lot older. I mean, Reagan in his first 4 years, I don't think looked a lot older, but by the time he had done 8.
I think Nixon would kind of look the same that he started in 72 as he did in 68.
Yeah. Well, he was already stressed out.
Yeah, I'm convinced that Nixon was bipolar by our by our current definitions.
Definition of bipolar, I could buy that. Yeah. And not treated.
Yeah.
And maybe
they probably didn't know how to treat that back then.
Yeah. No, it's true. I also think Nixon was probably one of the smartest men we ever had as president. Of course, the smartest, Woodrow Wilson, smart man, foolish.
Yeah. Well, as I said, one of the things I feel with the smartest man in the room syndrome and D&D terms, you have your high int, but wisdom is your dump stat, I find is often the situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that seems to be the situation.
See, I feel like my wisdom just, I feel like the older I get, the less things I'm sure of, but the more sure of I am of the things I know.
Right.
And that keeps shrinking though. So if I were to live to be 100, I think I would know, I may know one thing that I'm really sure of.
Yeah.
Which probably is I don't know anything.
Well, socialism is bad. You'll probably be very convinced that socialism is very bad when you're 100.
Yes. Well, I certainly don't believe that it has. Jordan Peterson had a great comment on the whole, well, it hasn't really been tried yet. He says that's one of the most arrogant things you can say, because what you really mean is if you were in charge, you'd do it right. And who the hell are you to say that? Sunshine. I don't know. He throws in all those little things, but I thought that's pretty good. It's like, who are you to arrogantly say you've got it right?
Right.
One of the things I do like about Ricochet is that people, you can see a bunch of different kind of competing things. So like one of the threads that was just up was about what's your ideal tax? And there were lots of interesting, tax structure, lots of interesting things that people put in.
To me, I think the question is, I kind of look at it as an engineering problem. What is your goal via your tax? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to maximize tax revenue? Are you trying to do what often seems to be happening is social engineering? Or you just want to pay for things? And I remember having this conversation with one of my ex-girlfriends who's like, well, this tax isn't fair. And I'm like, let's say there was a perfect tax. Would you be okay with it if in that perfect tax for 5%? And it would fund all your government programs, and it would even stop global warming and bring and make all the flowers extra fragrant. But it's 5%, and everyone has to pay 5% of their income, no matter what it is, how rich they are. Are you okay with that? And she wasn't. She didn't think it was fair that someone was paying $1 billion, making $1 billion, was paying the same tax rate as someone, even if it would solve global warming.
Well, and they said it wasn't. Obama said that it was not. It doesn't matter. Basically we need to be more punitive.
Yeah.
Except there's no way to be punitive enough to the rich people. There's no way you can tax Jeff Bezos enough to make it hurt as much as FICA coming out of a minimum wage workers pension.
Yeah.
And for one thing, you'd never be able to pass that legislation because him and all of his really rich buddies would stand against it.
Yeah. The only way that kind of thing has happened has been usually through violent revolution, in which the Soviets showed in 1917, or in the Civil War goes up until 22. So, yeah, I guess they did send up a lot of guys. We have a friend of mine had this, a rail baron game, where you were playing like railroad barons and World War I Russia, and the under the box says like, your goal is to become the richest man, so you'll be the first person put up against the wall and shot.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing that always worries me right now is I feel like the elites in the West are much like the aristocracy in France before the revolution.
Right.
Let them eat cake, whatever. We don't care. We've got ours. They just need to shut up. I don't like the outcome of the French Revolution.
No.
To this day, the reverberations of the French Revolution are awful. That just could have something to do with being French. I'm not sure.
No. I mean, like, I do not want to see anything like the Vendée happening, right? There's just so many bad things. Like, people focus on the war and the terror, and it's like, yeah, Paris is bad, but there's like stuff going off in the provinces that will put the terror to shame. Like,
if you continue to follow that model, the French Revolution eventually resulted in Napoleon.
Yep. And even after that, you ended up with the final revolution, as I often think of it, is what happens after the Germans invade in 1870. And they surround the Paris Commune, and they call it, I think it's called, 7 or 8 bloody days. They just firing squad, they say about 15 to 20,000 people put up against the wall and shot. And they said, and then France didn't have any revolutions for 50 years.
Yeah. I worry, the thing that makes me worry about the Napoleon thing is if the United States suddenly became truly imperialist, like, everybody wants to claim we are, that would not be good for the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it would fulfill my dream of finally dealing with China, I think. But, an imperialist United States, you know what? We got to go acquire resources, and we're done with all this green crap, and we want to burn oil. There's oil in Mexico we can go take. Well, there's oil in Canada we can go take. We've always wanted to take over Canada. No. Oh my God.
There there is a novel by a guy named Tom Cratton, who's I want to say these ex-lawyer army colonels writing science fiction. And his one book called Caliphate, it ends up where the United States becomes very imperialistic in that regard and annexes Canada and the official policy becomes one of Islamic extermination after about 8 cities were nuked, including New York.
If you nuked 8 major cities in the United States of America, including New York, it would be a profoundly more conservative nation.
Oh yeah. In his book, the second in the Pat Buchanan is vice president.
Oh God!
At one point, after the nuking, the next, it's not a Republican; it's a new political party. But Pat Buchanan is the vice president.
Wow! Yeah. Woo. Well, of course, the thing is, so much of science fiction got all of these things going on. And people, so is COVID a black swan? I don't really know how much of a black swan COVID is, but
yeah,
something. The thing is, we are basically at the point where we're completely sorted out from World War II.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it.
And so now the world is entering his entrance, and it's taken a generation, I think, from kind of the Soviet Union falling. Mm-hmm. For this to come through, and China's doing its thing, and it's like, what's the world going to look like now? And it's really entering into more of a normal phase.
Yeah.
What we grew up in and what our parents grew up in was abnormal.
Yeah.
And if you look back before World War I, World War I was what happened when industrialization was fully folded into the art of war.
Yeah.
And World War II was just, to me, part 2, right? It was literally, we've got airplanes now. This is what industrialization looked like. Yeah. Ending with nuclear bombs going off, which kind of moved to, if we fight a full scale, knockdown, drag out, total war again,
yeah,
it could be really bad. But if you think about before World War I, the European powers would just fight these little wars, and it wouldn't be any big deal, and we'd trade some land back and forth and whatever, right?
Yeah,
they weren't
it's all
engaged.
about maintaining the balance of power.
Yeah.
In Europe.
And then World War I comes along, and they basically World War I destroys Europe.
Yeah.
Except for Canada, that's like the European country that's not in Europe.
Yeah, it's true. Anyone doesn't believe me, go to Montreal and look around.
So we're settled, and we're fully settled out from that as a planet. And now what do we do? Yeah. And now what's the world going to look like? And I do think China's very threatening. I think in the long run, China will collapse under its own foolishness as these things go. I know they got a lot of money, and I know there's a lot of people in the West that are busy sucking up to them and selling out to them. Mm-hmm. They still have something like 10, 15 million people living in caves.
Yep.
Caves.
Yep.
And their industrialized part of their country is about our size and is not nearly as productive. But it's not like they can just turn around and do rural electrification and get all the other billion people up to speed. Meanwhile, they have they've built cities that are empty.
Right.
That are crap built. Because communists can't build anything that's I remember I went to Romania, right? You had stuff built by the Romans.
Yep.
Still working. Stuff built by the communists disintegrating. So my concern is as China goes under ultimately, how much damage does it do in its death throes?
Right. I mean, like, one has to look back at what was happening in Wuhan, China in 2020, when they stopped all internal flights in China coming out of Wuhan, but they kept the international flights going. You know that someone is doing something bad when that's happening.
You're right. Like, what? And the other, and the other thing that it's kind of funny because it's, people with China, you'll see some concern, we just need to break the country up.
Mm-hmm.
John Walker used to be big on that. We don't need to have the big 19th century railroad sized empires. Okay. But there's bad actors out there.
Oh, you mean break up the United States?
Yeah.
Wow.
The thing, well, says the guy sitting in Switzerland.
Yeah.
Who I know, okay, they've got mountains and they can blow up bridges and they have guns and yada, yada, yada. Had the Soviet Union wanted to take over Switzerland, it could have taken over Switzerland.
Oh, yeah.
And
Hitler wanted to take Switzerland, he could have taken Switzerland.
Yeah. So I get it, but the reality is your big neutral Switzerland, you exist at the sufferance of the major powers. And Switzerland's existed at the sufferance of the major powers for centuries.
Yeah. Everyone needs a place to go where the banks are not going to ask any questions.
Right. And, exactly. And it's in the middle of Europe and you're kind of there. And it's not that worth conquering you because would be a pain in the ass.
Yeah. So,
as opposed to like what, Sarajevo, I think that's been rebuilt 50 times or something. So what the United States can be is a nation. It commands the resources of a continent. It controls it can deploy its navies into both major oceans. It's worthwhile to have the United States to be a peacekeeper.
Right.
And now, does that mean other countries don't have to spend as much on military? Yeah, that's true. But I love that my nation has the longest unsecure border in the world with another nation.
Right.
I mean, that's that when push comes to shove, I mean, I think most Americans just think of Canadians as, well, aren't y'all kind of like us, but you got that Quebec thing and you say a lot, and it's cold,
yeah.
And again, it's the American point of view on everything, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for 9/11, we could still cross the border without passports.
Right.
I don't.
It took like 4 years for them to install that.
Yeah, I don't see. I don't think there's a lot of terrorists trying to sneak into the country from Canada. Nor would we have a bunch of illegal immigration from Canada. So
yeah, it's interesting. People are always talking about the World Economic Forum and how they're planning on taking over the planet and they're behind all this stuff. But the fact is, until 2020 was going to be the pilot year. They had created a deal between Canada and the Netherlands to basically make it universal passport between us. That I could have, I didn't even know this was happening until like 3 months ago when I was researching it. I could have gone to, if COVID hadn't happened, I could have gone to the Netherlands and lived and worked, and vice versa. That was something that was in the works. And we were also, before COVID, there was a big movement to create CanZook, which would have been like universal travel between the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But I think that probably gone away after Australia started their concentration camps.
Right. That's holy cow. Yeah. Well, I think I've said before, I don't know if I've said on Land of Confusion podcast, but I kind of look at the Anglosphere like a big family, Britain is like dad. France is kind of like mom, and so you've got the United States as the oldest child who, I'm out of here. I'm going to go do my own thing.
Yep.
Canada is the very nice middle child who behaves.
Yep.
Australia and New Zealand are like childs 3 and 4 that the parents don't pay that much attention to anymore anyway.
Right.
Right. And of course, India is the illegitimate child dad had when he was on campaign.
Yeah. That's a great way to describe India.
And after World War II, to some degree, Japan is the little Asian child that we adopted.
Well, you got to remember World War One, and before World War One, Britain and Japan were in an alliance, and it was the interference of the Canadian Prime Minister who convinced the British to break the alliance.
Really?
And because of that,
which of course that was in the Americans' interest.
It was because of the Americans' interest. So the argument was between the Australian Prime Minister, who was saying we need to keep the Japanese on side, and the Canadian Prime Minister, who was saying, no, we need the Americans more. And in some ways, I think that America would have just been on side, and Britain and Japan would have been better off to make that deal between them for them. Not necessarily for the benefit of the United States, but for those two.
But there was a point at which the United States was, after World War I, the United States was the biggest threat to Britain.
Right.
I mean, the Washington and London naval treaties were all about not getting into it, was all about Britain with its empire not wanting to get into a naval arms race with the United States, which even in the middle of the Great Depression, the United States already could outproduce Britain.
Right.
So, and Japan was, the only other significant navy. I mean, of course, the British are like, well, the Germans might be a problem again. And it's just fascinating to me about World War II is everybody expected a war. They just expected it later, including Hitler, who then went to war early.
Yeah. It's
like, what, you couldn't wait? You couldn't wait 4 more years?
Yep. But my interest into what happened with Japan is I was on this forum with a bunch of World War II guys, and someone said, how could Japan possibly win World War II? And I suddenly said, I could tell you, declare war in Germany in 1941. And the guys are like, oh shit, he's right.
Yeah. Well, one of the guys I watch is Strock NFL. He's got a naval channel on YouTube. And people have asked him that, how could the Japanese have beaten the United States? He said it was very easy. Don't attack the United States.
Right.
Because in it, and anybody who's played any sort of strategic, either turn-based or quote unquote real-time strategy games, if I have a base of production that the enemy can't attack, and I can attack his base of production, I will win.
Right.
and that, Germany didn't invest in heavy bombers, long-range heavy bombers.
Yeah, the guy who was in charge of that, he died in 1935 in a plane crash.
In a plane crash. Well, that's ironic. I remember I read it was a great book. Can I check it out from the library? That's old. But it was about, I might have it, but it was about Germany and the economics of Germany. And the guys walking through the book, and basically what it boils down to is they just couldn't win. As long as the Allies didn't give up, they couldn't win. And, it's like Germany, well, they conquered France. Turns out the French people, I guess from our point of view, I don't think probably work very hard as it is. But when you're conquered by the Germans, they really don't work very hard.
Right.
They got very low productivity out of France. It's like, great, you've conquered like a computer game. I conquered the territory and I have to pay to occupy it. And it's a net minus.
Yeah.
So
I mean, France was still fighting, but of course the communists were ordered to labor strike after the army lost at Sedan. So a lot of war production just dropped off the face of the earth. because all the factory workers were taking their orders from Stalin, who was in an alliance with Germany.
Right up until they invaded Poland.
No, invaded Russia.
Oh, right, invaded Russia. Yes, sorry. And it's like, oh, which then came as, I don't know, dictators are stupid.
Yeah.
Going back to our previous conversation about politics.
From what I can tell, Stalin just didn't want to. He's like, I need another year. Whatever I can do to get Hitler not to attack me for another year is what I'm going to do. That's his thinking there. And that's why he's like ignoring this, like all the warning signs are coming. But it's like, but all my stuff is all in refit right now. Like, I'm like, I need another year. Can't I just bribe him a bit more?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like, why did Hitler declare war on the United States?
That being said, it would United States would declare war on Germany.
I think
Germany
so.
Almost within.
Hey, I would be all for the United States declaring war on people before they sent a bunch of troops over there.
Yeah,
that's
it was like people say no way that people would have gone along with that. I'm like, I remember 9/11. Like if George W. Bush could say, "Let's go attack or can get a war out of Iraq." FDR can get a war into Germany in 3 months. Like, don't give me any crap on that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What's really funny is, too, Chris, it's we're going to do a Europe first. They still poured a lot of energy into the Pacific.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And it's not like we're doing Europe first, but we're going to stop building the SX aircraft carriers, which are already under construction.
Yeah. It's almost easier to say we're going to do Europe first because it'll be easier. We need 2 years to build up our Navy forces so we can take Japan.
Right.
But we can immediately do something about Germany because Britain's Navy will get our troops across.
Right. And of course, the thing with Japan is, and it's not like Japan's actually going to be able to come do anything to us.
Yeah.
They maxed out their capacity to attack Pearl Harbor. And granted, in the beginning of 1942, the Kido Butai was the most powerful force afloat in the Pacific. Later in 1942, that was no longer the case, but
even then, and even if they had managed to keep that carrier force intact going into 44, where the Americans are still 80 carriers to their 20.
Yeah, I don't know. When as Drac calls them, the Essex Swarm, and when the United States was spitting out a destroyer a day, and all of these carriers are coming online, and all of these airplanes are coming online, and the Japanese were foolish the way they would deploy their pilots, and you basically flew until you died. Would rotate people back, and then you're going to teach new pilots. And right, the Japanese did what non-Western nations do, is they somewhat aped the Western way of doing things, but they didn't fully do it. And that's kind of what the Chinese are doing. They're trying to pick and choose, but I think eventually it's going to collapse on them.
Yeah.
What concerns me about some of our leaders here is they don't want to, I want socialism, and they take it all for granted. It was my favorite stories coming out of the Middle East was, and if you ever get a chance to read some of the declassified CIA documents on these other cultures, it's fascinating. So I think it was Jordan, some sort of military equipment, we'd sold them and they're putting them out, and here's the manuals to use it. And the sergeant took up all the manuals for himself. And the Americans like, what are you doing? I need these. So for him, I had to have the instruction, the repair manuals, so he could have his power.
Yeah. A story Mark once told me is that he was our friend Mark from our game. He was telling me about how he was watching this documentary once, and they got this British colonel on who is during the Arab-Israeli wars, and they're talking. Some reporters talking to him, sort of like, so the Arabs outnumber the Israelis like 10-1. So who's going? They're clearly going to win. And he's like, no, they're not. And he's like, what do you mean? Well, this is how an Arab commander is going to go to his sergeant, his lieutenant, and say, Bob, we're invading Israel tomorrow. I need you to get 50 guys with jeeps and stuff. Okay, sir. I need you to get a map of Israel. Here's $50. Go get me the map. And the lieutenant's like, sure. And he's going to find the cheapest map he can find, buy it, and then pocket the difference before giving it back to his colonel. And then they're going to look at all their jeeps. And they're going to say, hey, all these Jeeps have spare tires on them. Well, God doesn't want us to lose. So we're going to sell all the spare tires and all the other stuff on these Jeeps because we're not going to need them. Nothing could possibly go wrong. God is on our side. And then they're going to drive in and all these things are going to start happening where that. And he's like, and that's the entire Arab army. Except for Jordan.
Well, it's and actually that actually played out. So you have places in the Yom Kippur War where a tank, right? This is these insane stories of one determined tank. There's some guy, I forget all the details, but it's like he hears the explosions going on because of course you can hear them. Israel's not all that big. You can hear them across.
Yeah.
Races, gets into a tank, charges off. He's doing radio communications. They're like, we're trying to get people to you. Can you hold? It's just him.
Yep.
And that it's the same sort of thing with D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
Only a Western military could have gotten off Omaha Beach.
Oh yeah.
And I might even go so far as to say an American army. I discovered, I was talking to somebody and I discovered something I didn't understand, I didn't know before. He says, well, most militaries teach people that you need, if you, when in doubt, stop and wait for orders. And it's like even the Western ones. Is but in the United States, and I told that to my wife, who's, this was in the Army Reserve. She says it's ridiculous. That's not what they told us as an officer. And what they told us was when in doubt, attack. Move. You never do nothing. Do something. It might be wrong. Do something. Move. And I remember reading some. I think it was a Frenchman talking about the Americans in Afghanistan, and that they were with. He says these Americans are crazy. What do? Oh, we're under attack. They get up and charge. And I talked to somebody who was in Afghanistan. I said, yeah, the most nerve-rattling thing that have us do is walk towards people and take called shots and shoot them while they're shooting at us. I'm like, what? He says they generally couldn't hit you. You had on body armor. And so, but think about that. Think about that from their side. These guys stand up, start walking towards you calmly, and just keep shooting you. If you poke your head out, you're getting shot at, even though you're shooting at them. That's like something out of science fiction,
right? From
their point of view. What but very Western. They talk about the Romans. They might march with drums or things, but literally this Roman columns coming towards you. The barbarians are yelling and shouting. The Romans are just marching in formation.
Right.
Well, I've thought about, the stuff bounced off their shields. The Romans have thrown stuff at you, but their pylons are designed to land and break, so you can't throw them back. And then all of a sudden, the Romans charge.
Yep.
It's inhuman and mechanistic and awful, and I just assume we not have to use. It'd be nice if we didn't have to do any of that. There's a bunch of bad actors in the world.
Yep. But I definitely can say other armies could have gotten off that beach, but not only the Western armies would have been getting off that beach. Certainly the German army at that time. The German army problem is that they just don't have, they're very good at operational and throwing together scratch units and throwing them together. And like, you're pretty sure they're defeated. And now there's like, no, there's a battalion out of nowhere. Where'd that come from?
Right.
But their problem is they didn't have like the staffing available to just figure out every little detail that America and Britain were basically doing to figure things out. They're very good, much better on the operational flight. They would definitely be guys who would have known how to get off Omaha Beach.
Yeah,
but they wouldn't have thought to land at Omaha Beach because they wouldn't have done the planning.
Yeah. Well, except for their one guy.
Mhm.
Or I don't know if it's true or not, but it's in The Longest Day.
Yep.
I win because I do what is unexpected.
He's one of the guys who came up with Barbarossa.
Really?
Yeah.
You know, had they just let Guderian go all the way to Moscow instead of stopping him, they would have probably could have taken Stalin.
Yes, maybe. It's hard to say. People don't realize just it's like, I was at a conference a few years ago, and they were talking about war in the mega cities was the big thing for the U.S. wargaming, professional level wargaming. Like these guys are advising the Joint Chiefs, and the guys are saying all these things, and I'm like, the worry's like, how do you conquer a city like Washington D.C. in modern day terms? And that's really the problem with when you're trying to take out like Moscow in that period. And as we later saw when they did to Berlin in 45, these things are hard things to take. They're going to take you for months to get to. So even if Guderian got there faster, and I've read those campaigns, they're not as easy as people think they are because Russia doesn't have like this thing called roads. I just still think that if Hitler hadn't messed with them, they'd have had a better chance. Yes, no, it's hard to say. They kept Hitler is the one who keeps telling them to keep going. Like it's hard. The best thing they could have done is, as a friend of mine said, is you don't go all the way into. The big mistake is trying to conquer Russia all in one go.
Right.
In the way that Napoleon does in 1812, you're better to get in, dig in at a certain position and have them break themselves against you, and then getting a ceasefire when you're somewhere in Ukraine.
Well, and the people that you liberate actually liberate them instead of conquering them.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about burning, but their dictatorship and their and effectively God's behind us. And
yeah, they have a lot of that kind of situation. They're just have military discipline to go along with it. But yeah. But we're a Ricochet podcast. Do you want to talk about the other post that happened or the other event that happened yesterday, and that your arch nemesis had a more reflective post?
Oh, that Gary had a post.
Well, Gary's post was good, but I was talking about John Gabriel's Jan 6 1 year anniversary of his post.
Well, I will say first off, I'm always going to celebrate somebody's recovery, even if it's a inveterate liberal someplace. Addiction's horrible. I've seen that. So anytime somebody get out of addiction, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think kind of the where I feel what happened with John was very clear. Is he was horrified to see a bunch people in some of the footage, and responded very strongly. Yeah,
responded in emotion at the moment, and as as I always tell people, should wait 24 hours before comment on anything like that. School shootings or whatever were usually my thing, but mass shootings were. You're not thinking clearly.
And where I think John disappointed me was he never came out and said that was an emotional post and maybe I overreacted. He kind of owned it and said, nope, this is the way it should be. And and so which you kind of see on the internet is this, it's very hard for people to say, maybe I was mistaken.
Yeah.
And, so ultimately we have this event that happens and it's Trump's fault.
Yeah.
And even though people come in, it's, well, Trump shouldn't have been, and it really aged poorly because you look at Miley Hemingway's book Rigged, you looked at all the, if people have not seen on Ricochet all the work that St. Augustine has done compiling things, it's painfully obvious that our electoral system in the United States is it's like we're operating on an 18th century electoral system, and the rest of the Western world is much better off.
Right.
And so, you know, it's not unreal. And the other side had done it. The other side spent, you know, Byron York came out with that thing, a post saying, well, it turns out there were even more people that thought that Trump wasn't legitimately elected versus folks. I think you have a majority of Republicans and a plurality of Democrats, I believe, that think that the 2020 election went on the up and up.
Yep.
So to take the position effectively, well, if you even say that, you're part of the problem. You know, this riot at the Capitol was, you know, it's almost a sense of that's partially your fault. No, I'm asking some questions, and it is funny to call people terrorists who stayed within the velvet ropes.
Yeah.
Right.
There were some people there that were bad actors. There's definitely, but I remember one of the reporters who was covering it, who was recovering it, and he said, I looked over and I saw a lot of these guys that I've recognized who are the right-wing agitators fighting with the cops. And then I looked to my left, not 50 yards away, and the cops are letting people in, just letting them in. And to do a tour of the Capitol. Like, so you got, and most of the people who are doing the tour of the Capitol are the ones that are now in prison, and the people who are fighting with the cops are not.
Right. Yeah.
And why
so,
is that?
Yeah. Right. Well, and I begin to think that the people fighting with the cops, then maybe they were being, they're, you know, it was part of an operation. It's like the whole Whitmer. You have several people who have been charged with threatening to kill a governor. Why hasn't more come out about that?
Yep.
Well, because it's some of the, this FBI person and this informant and that, and you know, I'm beginning to think the FBI can't actually solve any cases. They have to make them up.
Yep. and we certainly saw that in the early days of the war of terror, where they would be like, all these, we've arrested this terrorist cell, and you're looking at the records and like, these terrorists that you contacted them, you organized them, gave them weapons and bombs, and then you arrested them. You call that entrapment.
Yeah, that's entrapment. And meanwhile, you ignored the Boston bombers.
Yep.
Right. You weren't able to catch them. And by the way, you weren't able to capture any of the 9/11 people ahead of time.
Yep.
Right. So you're really pretty useless for combating terrorism unless you make it up.
Yep.
Maybe they're still good at catching bank robbers. I don't know, or finding kidnapped victims. I mean,
it reminds me of the 1990s when it turns out like all the different agencies, the ATF, the FBI, and all these other things ended up being like running the militia movement against Clinton. Like all the organizing head ringleaders were all members, either informants or actual undercover agents. And they were getting together and having meetings where they were plotting to overthrow the government when they were actually all government agents.
Right. So it's like, okay, hey, this looks bad. Let's go burn down a bunch of religious cultists. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to be working well, and we want to stir things up. And it is, I think, unfortunate that what we have is there's a lot of people on the right who are intellectuals and pundits and whatnot, who I think want to be more a part of the thoughtful class. I want to be considered thoughtful, even though that post was really emotional. And they sacrifice, you know, it's so important for me to be part of that class. I'm going to sacrifice something to be a part of it. I know it's kind of funny. Jonah Goldberg used to always sneer, we don't go to cocktail parties. There's no such thing as Georgetown cocktail parties. And I think that's exactly emblematic of some of the anti-Trump stuff, which is, well, that specifically doesn't happen. Hey, it's shorthand.
Yeah.
Right. It's shorthand and symbolic for something. And this whole I think you get all of these wordsmiths.
Mhm.
I ran into this to one of the attorneys on Ricochet, where we were talking about something National Review had said about the Covington kids.
Yep.
And somebody, oh, the Covington kids. Well, you had National Review pulled an article that said that they literally spat on the crucifix. And we had a member say, no, they didn't actually say that. If you link to the article, they didn't actually say that. Mm-hmm. And the title of the article was "The Covington Kids Might As Well Have Spit on the Crucifix."
Right.
So, all right, you're picking a nick over the choice of somebody's word literally. I guess we need to defend the word literally, but
yeah.
Right. The gist of this post is in fact correct.
Right.
But the wordsmith types mm-hmm. that make their living that way mm-hmm. want to be picky about the words.
Right.
And use that. Well, you weren't perfectly accurate. Therefore, the sentiment is bad? And Trump, one of the things about Trump is he's full of saying things that are more symbolic than necessarily factual.
Right.
By the way, which is that's what the Democrats do. They never say anything that's true. Mm-hmm. But our side's going to be busy attacking Trump or anybody else who uses a little bit of hyperbole. Well, how dare you use hyperbole? We just don't want to get too upset or passionate about anything. That's just not proper, and it's weird. But some of it to me goes back to wanting to be the smartest guy in the room. Where we started.
Yeah. And, I find often when we come full circle, that's usually a good place to end it.
All righty.
Well, yeah, everyone, I hope you've had an interesting evening. I certainly have after a bit of a day at work. So it's good to, I guess we'll see you on the comments on Ricochet.
All right. See you there. All right. Bye.